The year is 1682, and the Sun King, Louis XIV, has just officially moved his court to the glittering golden palace of Versailles, a monument to human vanity that would define the era of absolute monarchy. From the outside, Louis was a god on earth, a man whose every movement was calculated to reflect the glory of France and the divine right of the Bourbons. But the terrifying truth is that behind the silk tapestries, the heavy gold leaf, and the towering powdered wigs lay a reality of profound physical decay and staggering filth. In the corridors of the world's most opulent palace, the stench was often so overwhelming that visitors had to press scented handkerchiefs to their faces just to avoid fainting. The king himself, the center of this magnificent solar system, was a man who, according to his own doctors, almost never bathed. Louis XIV believed that water was a dangerous substance that opened the pores to disease, and his personal hygiene consisted of nothing more than a servant rubbing his face and hands with a cloth soaked in spirits. This was the era of dry washing, where cleanliness was judged not by the state of one's skin, but by the whiteness of one's linen and the strength of one's perfume. Don't you dare look away. Watch this entire deep dive documentary and subscribe to Crown of Dread, and you will learn the one shocking record that proves the king's surgeons performed a procedure so grotesque it left him unable to eat without constant embarrassment. The morning light at Versailles did not reveal a god, but a man struggling against the consequences of his own bizarre beliefs. The king's day began not with a private moment of reflection, but with a highly orchestrated public performance known as the Lever, or the Royal Rising. Every morning, dozens of high-ranking nobles would crowd into the king's bedchamber, competing for the privilege of watching the monarch wake up, wash his hands, and be dressed. This was not a mere formality. It was a weapon of absolute control. Louis used these intimate moments to domesticate the French aristocracy, turning the proudest warriors and landowners of the realm into domestic servants who fought for the right to hold his shirt or hand him his wash basin. The terrifying reality of life at Versailles was that one's political career depended entirely on being seen by the king during these daily rituals. To be absent from the lever was to be politically dead. Louis understood that by forcing the elite to participate in these demeaning public displays of service, he stripped them of their independence and ensured their total loyalty to his person. This illustrates the terrifying historical reality of the cult of personality in an absolute monarchy. Louis showed that a ruler can use the most mundane personal habits to build a cage of gold for his potential rivals. The hygiene of the palace itself was a source of constant, invisible horror that stood in stark contrast to its architectural beauty. While Versailles boasted magnificent fountains and sprawling gardens, it lacked even the most basic plumbing for its thousands of inhabitants. Nobles and servants alike were often forced to relieve themselves in the corners of hallways, behind staircases, or even behind the very tapestries that depicted the king's military victories. The air inside the palace was a thick, stagnant mixture of sweat, unwashed bodies, human waste, and the heavy, cloying scents of musk and ambergris used to mask the smell. The king's own apartments were not immune to this atmospheric decay, and the smell of the Sun King was often described as being as powerful as his political influence. This demonstrates the ultimate historical disconnect between the ideal of royalty and the reality of biological existence. Louis XIV proved that you can build the most beautiful palace in the world, but without the discipline of hygiene, it remains a monument to human waste. The medical practices of the late 17th century added a layer of systemic scientific terror to the king's daily life. Louis XIV was a man of immense physical appetite, but his diet and his doctors were often his greatest enemies. His physicians, following the theories of the time, believed that most illnesses were caused by bad humors that had to be physically removed from the body. This meant that the king was subjected to constant aggressive purging and bloodletting. It is recorded that Louis was given thousands of enemas throughout his life, often performed as a public or semi-public event, which the king believed was necessary to maintain his health. This obsession with internal cleansing was a terrifying and invasive ritual that the monarch accepted as part of his divine duty. This illustrates the terrifying historical danger of medical orthodoxy. Louis showed that even the most powerful man in the world can be a victim of the experts of his time, enduring procedures that were as useless as they were degrading. The psychological atmosphere of the court was one of stifling, permanent performance, where everyone, including the king, was trapped in a cycle of endless, exhausting rituals. Louis XIV never allowed himself to be seen in a state of disarray or human weakness. Even when he was suffering from agonizing ailments, he forced himself to maintain the rigid posture and the haughty expression of the Sun King. This demand for perfection extended to every member of the court, creating an environment of intense, competitive vanity. People spent fortunes on clothes, wigs, and perfumes, not for their own pleasure, but to avoid the king's devastating disapproval. The cost of this vanity was not just financial, it was a total loss of privacy and personal dignity. This illustrates the fundamental historical reality of the Versailles system. It was a place where human beings were transformed into decorative objects for the amusement and the glory of a single man. The king's stench was hidden by perfume, and the court's misery was hidden by gold. We have witnessed the start of the Sun King's day, but the truly grotesque medical secrets of his later years are yet to be revealed. The king's appetite was as legendary as his political ambition, but the terrifying truth is that his massive consumption of food led to a series of physical complications that turned his later years into a constant struggle with his own biology. Louis XIV was known to consume enormous quantities of meat, poultry, and sweets during his multi-course banquets, often eating enough in one sitting to feed several men. This excessive indulgence was not just a matter of greed, but a display of royal power. The Sun King had to be superior in all things, including his capacity to consume the wealth of his kingdom. However, this lifestyle had a devastating effect on his digestive system, leading to chronic issues that his doctors attempted to treat with increasingly violent and experimental methods. The king suffered from severe dental problems, and by the age of 40, his physicians decided that the best course of action was to remove all the teeth from his upper jaw. This was performed without any form of anesthesia, a brutal and agonizing process that left the monarch's mouth permanently damaged. The terrifying reality of this procedure was revealed during his meals, as the lack of upper teeth caused a physical gap between his mouth and his nasal cavity. It is recorded that when the king drank, liquid would often escape through his nose, a grotesque sight that he had to manage with imperial dignity while his courtiers pretended not to notice. This demonstrates the ultimate historical cost of royal excess and the primitive nature of early modern medicine. Louis XIV proved that even the most powerful man on earth could be reduced to a state of physical misery by the very people sworn to heal him. The medical treatments the king endured were not limited to his mouth. His physicians were obsessed with his internal health, leading to a regime of purges that would be considered torture by modern standards. Following the theory that the king's body was constantly producing corrupt humors due to his diet, he was subjected to a staggering number of laxatives and emetics. It is estimated that throughout his life, Louis was given thousands of purgative treatments, sometimes dozens in a single month. This constant chemical assault on his body led to chronic dehydration and permanent digestive distress. Yet the king believed these treatments were the secret to his longevity. This obsession with purging was a public affair, as the results of these treatments were often discussed by his doctors in the presence of the court to assess the health of the monarchy. This illustrates the terrifying historical reality of the body politic, where the monarch's most private functions were treated as matters of state importance. Louis showed that the price of absolute power was the total surrender of his physical privacy to a group of fanatical and misguided medical experts. The atmosphere of the Versailles dinner table was a masterpiece of social tension and hidden revulsion, where the king's physical struggles were managed through a rigid and unforgiving etiquette. No one was allowed to speak to the king unless he spoke first, and the focus was entirely on the ritual of the meal rather than the enjoyment of food. The courtiers had to watch in silence as the toothless monarch struggled to chew his meat, their faces fixed in expressions of forced admiration, while the air around them was thick with the smells of the king's untreated dental infections and his unwashed body. This contrast between the elegance of the gold-rimmed plates and the reality of the king's physical condition was a terrifying test of the nobility's loyalty. To show any sign of disgust or even to notice the king's difficulties was to risk immediate social exile. This demonstrates the terrifying psychological power of the Sun King's court. Louis proved that by controlling the social narrative, he could force an entire elite to ignore the evidence of their own senses, turning a grotesque biological reality into a sacred imperial ceremony. The king's health issues also extended to his lower body, leading to one of the most famous and agonizing medical episodes in the history of the French monarchy. In 1686, Louis developed a painful anal fistula, a condition exacerbated by his frequent horse riding and his constant use of enemas. For months, the king lived in silent agony, unable to sit or walk without immense pain, while his doctors argued over the best course of treatment. The terrifying truth is that when non-invasive methods failed, the king's primary surgeon, Charles-François Félix, decided to perform a radical and unprecedented surgery. Félix spent months practicing the procedure on dozens of poor patients from the hospitals of Paris, many of whom did not survive the experimentation. When the day of the king's surgery finally arrived, it was performed in total secrecy, with the monarch refusing to cry out or show any sign of weakness during the cutting and cauterizing of his flesh. This act of immense physical fortitude was celebrated as a victory of the royal will over human frailty, but it also highlighted the extreme and dangerous risks the monarchy was willing to take to maintain its image of perfection. This illustrates the terrifying historical reality of the experimental nature of royal medicine. Louis showed that his body was not just a person, but a laboratory where the limits of human endurance were tested for the glory of the throne. The legacy of the king's physical struggles was a court culture that became increasingly obsessed with health, disease, and the artificial preservation of youth. As the king aged and his ailments multiplied, the nobility began to mimic his medical rituals, viewing his frequent purges and his stoicism in the face of pain as the height of fashion. The palace became a place where the fear of death was managed through a constant, obsessive focus on the body's functions and a reliance on perfumes to hide the reality of decay. This demonstrates the fundamental historical truth of the Versailles system. It was a place where the human condition was suppressed through ritual and gold, but it could never be entirely escaped. The Sun King's stench was a constant reminder that beneath the divine image lay a mortal man, and the court's total devotion to him was a way of warding off the inevitable reality of their own mortality. We have seen the king's private medical battles, but the most humiliating rituals of his public life and the dark fate of his successors are yet to be explored. The absolute power of Louis XIV was not only exercised in the council chambers or on the battlefields of Europe, but in the most private and seemingly mundane moments of his daily existence, turning even his biological needs into a theater of imperial dominance. The terrifying truth of the Versailles system was that the king's body was public property, and every function it performed was a chance for a courtier to gain or lose favor. One of the most shocking and humiliating rituals for the French nobility was the brevet de fer, which allowed a select group of high-ranking aristocrats to be present while the king sat on his close stool or royal commode. This was not considered a moment of privacy or embarrassment for the Sun King. On the contrary, it was a position of immense prestige for the courtier who was allowed to stand in the room and discuss matters of state while the monarch relieved himself. The king used this ritual to signal who was truly in his inner circle, forcing the most powerful men in France to wait upon him in his most vulnerable state. This demonstrates the ultimate historical use of humiliation as a tool of political domestication. Louis XIV showed that by stripping away the boundaries of personal privacy, he could ensure that his nobles were constantly reminded of their subordinate status. The smell of the royal chamber was a small price to pay for the chance to whisper in the ear of the most powerful man in Christendom. The architecture of Versailles itself played a silent but deadly role in the physical and psychological control of the nobility, creating an environment where comfort was sacrificed for the sake of royal etiquette. While the palace was a masterpiece of Baroque design, it was also a place of extreme physical hardship. During the harsh French winters, the vast, high-ceilinged rooms were impossible to heat, and it was recorded that wine would frequently freeze in the decanters on the king's own table. The nobility, dressed in their heavy silks and elaborate wigs, suffered from constant cold, but they were forbidden from showing any discomfort in the king's presence. This physical endurance was seen as a test of loyalty. To complain about the cold or the drafts was to imply that the Sun King's palace was anything less than perfect. This illustrates the terrifying historical reality of the prestige trap, where individuals willingly endure physical suffering to maintain their social standing. Louis proved that by controlling the environment, he could force an entire elite to live in a state of permanent, high-level discomfort, ensuring they were too exhausted by the demands of court life to ever consider rebellion. The lack of personal hygiene among the thousands of people living within the palace walls created a toxic atmosphere that turned the gilded halls into a breeding ground for disease and parasitic life. Because bathing was so rare, lice and fleas were a constant and accepted part of life for even the highest-ranking nobles. The elaborate, towering wigs that were the fashion of the time were often infested with insects, and it was common for courtiers to carry small, decorative flea traps, silver or gold tubes filled with a piece of fur soaked in blood or honey, to attract the pests away from their bodies. The terrifying reality of Versailles was that under the heavy layers of powder and the scent of expensive perfumes, every person was locked in a constant struggle with filth. This contrast between the visual beauty of the court and the biological reality of its inhabitants is one of the most striking features of the Sun King's reign. It demonstrates the fundamental historical truth that opulence is often a thin veil used to hide the most basic and unpleasant aspects of the human condition. The king's control over the nobility extended even to their most personal habits and their financial survival, as he encouraged a culture of ruinous gambling and excessive spending to keep them dependent on his charity. Life at Versailles was an endless series of balls, operas, and card games, where the stakes were often higher than a noble's entire annual income. Louis XIII frequently paid the debts of his favorites, but this generosity came with a heavy price: total subservience. A nobleman who owed his lifestyle to the king's purse could never dare to oppose the king's will. This systematic destruction of the nobility's financial independence was a key part of the Sun King's strategy to prevent a repeat of the Fronde, the civil wars of his youth. The terrifying atmosphere of the palace was one of desperate competitive greed, where everyone was fighting for a share of the royal bounty while their own ancestral lands fell into neglect. This illustrates the historical danger of the dependent elite. Louis showed that by turning his rivals into his debtors, he could eliminate the threat of political opposition without ever having to draw a sword. The ultimate secret of the Sun King's court was the profound sense of boredom and spiritual emptiness that lay beneath the frantic surface of its rituals. Despite the constant entertainment and the magnificent surroundings, the life of a courtier was one of rigid, repetitive boredom. where every day followed a predetermined schedule that left no room for individual thought or spontaneity. The king himself was a prisoner of this system, forced to play the role of the god monarch from the moment he woke until the moment he was put to bed during the coucher, the evening equivalent of the rising ceremony. This total loss of human autonomy was the final and most devastating cost of the Versailles system. Louis XIV had created a world where he was the sun, but in doing so, he had ensured that everyone around him, including himself, was merely a cold, revolving satellite with no light of its own. This demonstrates the ultimate failure of absolute power to provide true satisfaction. The king's stench was a reminder of his mortality, and the court's rituals were a way of masking the terrifying realization that they were all trapped in a golden, airless void. We have seen the daily rituals of the Sun King, but the final agonizing days of his reign and the dark legacy he left for his successors are yet to be revealed. The final decade of Louis XIV's reign was a slow and agonizing descent into physical decay that transformed the Sun King into a living monument of human frailty. While the halls of Versailles continued to glow with gold, the monarch himself was increasingly confined to his apartments, his once magnificent body now a battleground of chronic diseases. The terrifying truth is that the king, who had spent his life avoiding water and relying on perfumes, was now suffering from a condition that no scent could mask: a slow, progressive gangrene in his leg. This was the ultimate irony of his life. The man who claimed to be a god on earth was being consumed by a microscopic enemy that his doctors did not understand. His physicians, still clinging to the outdated theories of the humors, initially refused to believe the severity of the situation, treating the blackened flesh with nothing more than hot cloths and herbal poultices. This illustrates the terrifying historical reality of the limits of medical knowledge. Louis XIV showed that even with the entire wealth of France at his disposal, he could not buy a single moment of relief from the natural processes of decay. The stench in the royal bedchamber became so potent that even the most loyal courtiers found it difficult to maintain their composure during the daily rituals. The king's dental health, which had been a source of misery for decades, reached a grotesque climax that profoundly affected his personality and his public image. After the brutal removal of his upper teeth years prior, the open connection between his mouth and his nasal cavity had become a site of chronic, foul-smelling infection. It is recorded that the king's breath was so offensive that people would instinctively recoil when he spoke, a devastating blow to a man who lived for the admiration of his court. To manage this, Louis relied even more heavily on strong perfumes, but the mixture of heavy musk and the scent of infected bone created an atmosphere that was truly nightmarish. This demonstrates the ultimate historical cost of royal vanity and the primitive state of 17th century dentistry. Louis proved that the divine monarch was subject to the same humiliating physical breakdowns as the lowest peasant, but he had to endure them on a stage where everyone was watching. The silence of the court during his meals was no longer just about etiquette. It was a desperate attempt to ignore the visible and olfactory evidence of the king's rotting face. The medical interventions during the king's final illness were a series of invasive and useless procedures that added a layer of systemic torture to his suffering. His doctors, fearing that the corruption in his leg would spread to his heart, began a regime of aggressive bloodletting and the administration of massive doses of toxic substances. The king was subjected to hundreds of painful incisions, and his bed became a site of constant, terrifying activity where surgeons and apothecaries argued over the best way to cleanse his royal blood. The terrifying reality was that every treatment only weakened the aging monarch further, draining his remaining strength while the gangrene continued its relentless march. This illustrates the terrifying historical danger of medical arrogance. Louis showed that the most dangerous place for a sick person in the 17th century was often in the care of the most famous doctors in the land. The king's stoicism in the face of this treatment was seen as a final proof of his greatness, but it was also a testament to the absolute power of a misguided medical orthodoxy. The psychological atmosphere of Versailles during the king's final days was one of suffocating gloom and intense, predatory intrigue. As it became clear that the Sun King was finally setting, the nobility began to position themselves for the coming regency, their loyalty to the dying monarch quickly being replaced by their ambition for future power. The palace, once a place of vibrant festivals, became a labyrinth of hushed conversations and secret meetings. Louis, sensing the change in the air, became even more obsessed with the minute details of court etiquette, as if by maintaining the outward form of his power, he could prevent its inevitable end. He forced himself to continue the public lever and coucher even when he could no longer stand, his body supported by servants as he played the part of the king one last time. This illustrates the fundamental historical reality of the succession crisis. Louis XIV proved that when a ruler bases their power entirely on their own person, their death creates a vacuum that threatens to collapse the entire state. The ultimate secret of the king's final hours was the profound regret he expressed for the very lifestyle he had spent decades cultivating. On his deathbed, he reportedly whispered to his young heir, the future Louis XV, that he should not imitate his love for grand buildings and constant wars, and that he should try to lighten the burden on his people. This was a stunning, last-minute admission that the gold of Versailles and the glory of his conquests had been built on a foundation of human suffering and immense national debt. The Sun King, who had spent his life projecting an image of divine perfection, ended his days by warning his successor against the very vanity that had defined his reign. This demonstrates the terrifying clarity that often comes with the approach of death. Louis showed that even the most successful autocrat in history could eventually see the hollow reality of their own absolute power. We have reached the final sunset of the Sun King, but the legacy of his filth and the catastrophic fate of the French monarchy he left behind are the final chapters of this dark history. The death of Louis XIV on September 5, 1915 was not the quiet departure of a saint, but a grim and protracted clinical event that symbolized the end of an era of unprecedented royal vanity. For weeks, the king's bedchamber had been a place of unimaginable suffering, as the gangrene that had started in his leg turned the royal body into a source of physical corruption that no amount of incense or perfume could counteract. The terrifying truth is that when the king finally took his last breath, the relief felt by his courtiers was as palpable as the grief they were forced to display. The Sun King had ruled for 72 years, and for many, his death felt less like the passing of a man and more like the collapse of a natural law. As his body was prepared for burial, the reality of his biological decay became so extreme that the traditional embalming procedures had to be accelerated to prevent the smell from overwhelming the entire palace. This illustrates the final historical irony of his reign. The man who had spent his life projecting an image of immortal solar brilliance ended his days as a cautionary tale of human putrefaction. The Sun King had set, leaving behind a kingdom that was exhausted, bankrupt, and spiritually hollowed out by decades of rigid ritual and absolute control. The immediate aftermath of the king's death revealed the terrifying fragility of the Versailles system, as the nobility, once so subservient, immediately began to dismantle the rigid structures of the old court. The regency that followed was a period of wild decadence and a desperate rejection of the Sun King's austerity, as if the entire elite were trying to scrub the memory of Louis's oppressive stench from their lives. However, the damage to the French state was already permanent. Louis had spent the nation's wealth on gold leaf and wars of prestige, leaving his 5-year-old great-grandson, Louis XV, a legacy of mounting debt and a dysfunctional administrative system. This demonstrates the fundamental historical danger of absolute power centered on a single personality. Louis XIV showed that a ruler can build a magnificent cage for his people, but once the keeper dies, the cage becomes a prison for those who remain. The Versailles system, which was designed to preserve the monarchy, had actually sown the seeds of its eventual and violent destruction. The long-term impact of Louis XIV's hygiene habits and medical rituals on French society was a bizarre and lasting obsession with appearances over reality that would persist until the Revolution. The dry washing and the reliance on heavy perfumes became the standard for the European elite, creating a culture where physical filth was tolerated as long as it was covered by silk and powder. This detachment from the physical reality of the body reflected a broader detachment from the social and economic realities of the kingdom. While the court continued to live in a world of artificial light and expensive scents, the rest of France was beginning to wake up to the stench of systemic inequality and corruption. This illustrates the ultimate historical cost of the Versailles lifestyle. Louis proved that by ignoring the basic needs of hygiene and human dignity, a ruling class can eventually become so alienated from the world that they no longer understand the forces that will eventually destroy them. The king's stench was a premonition of the revolutionary fire that would one day consume the palace and everyone within it. The ultimate secret of the Sun King's legacy is the way his personal myth survived despite the grotesque reality of his daily life. Even today, the name Louis XIV evokes images of the Hall of Mirrors and the height of French culture, while the stories of his rotting teeth, his thousands of enemas, and the filth of his corridors are often relegated to the footnotes of history. This is the final victory of the Sun King's propaganda. He successfully convinced the world that the gold was more real than the decay. The terrifying reality for a historian is recognizing how effectively a ruler can mask their own human frailty through the clever use of architecture, etiquette, and art. Louis showed that if you build a stage grand enough, the audience will eventually forget that the actor is only a man, and a sick one at that. His reign was a masterpiece of misdirection, a 70-year performance that hid the agonizing reality of a mortal body behind the mask of a god. We have revealed the entire grotesque truth of the Sun King's daily rituals. But now, we turn the final question to you, the crown of dread audience. Louis XIV built a system where personal hygiene and comfort were sacrificed for the sake of an absolute divine image that unified and glorified France in the eyes of the world. Do you believe that the creation of such a powerful national identity justifies the humiliating personal rituals and the staggering physical decay that both the king and his court were forced to endure? Let the world know your verdict. Drop your opinion in the comments below. Subscribe to Crown of Dread for more hidden history and find the truth buried beneath the oldest thrones.